The Canadian federal government has just done something that has some pretty serious implications, especially if you are a homeowner in or around Vancouver. Let's start with what actually happened. The federal government just signed a rights recognition agreement with the Musqueam Nation. The agreement basically recognizes that the Musqueam hold certain rights and title within their traditional territory. That territory includes large areas throughout Metro Vancouver, including Richmond, Burnaby, City of Vancouver, parts of Coquitlam, and, well, it's a pretty big map anyway. And here's where things get kind of murky. The agreement doesn't specify what lands are actually affected. Instead, it just recognizes that Aboriginal title can exist somewhere within that territory. Now, federal officials are saying that this is just a framework for future negotiations and it's nothing to be worried about. They stated specifically that private landowners won't be affected by this agreement. Now, that may or may not be true, but there are options that they could have used to further negotiations. And not to mention, at least from what's been released, there's no specific wording in the agreement that actually exempts private homeowners, private landowners. And to me anyway, the really weird part of this situation is that this wasn't really publicly announced. It was very quietly released on a Friday before a long weekend. That is anyway until small news outlets like Daily Hive picked up the story. Now, you would think that the big players in the BC news world would have picked up on this right away, and they absolutely would have jumped at the opportunity to publish this story. But they didn't. They stayed silent on it, for days, in fact. Kind of weird, right? But anyway, for now, let's jump into what this actually means. So here's where things start to get a little bit more complicated. You might remember that not too long ago, there was a BC Supreme Court ruling in Richmond regarding Aboriginal title. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, I did a video on it not too long ago. I will put the link in the description down below. You can go and check out the video there. But the gist of the ruling is that the court found that Aboriginal title can exist on a property that already has title on it, that already has a fee simple title. The ruling suggests that two titles can coexist on a single piece of property. One title under the modern land title system and another under the Aboriginal constitutional right to own land. The court also found that historic land grants do not eliminate Aboriginal title on private land, which means some private land today could still overlap with historic land title claims. Now, it also found that Aboriginal title is the senior charge on title, placing it over and above what's called fee simple title, which is what most landowners have. Now, thankfully, the court didn't force immediate changes, but it basically just created a whole ton of uncertainty, which means that these homeowners are effectively trapped until something changes. We're basically waiting for a settlement to happen or the appeals process to go through and, well, either overturn the case or change it or something of that nature. I'm not a lawyer. But if it's anything like anything else inside our legal system, that's going to take years before it's actually resolved. Now, this issue is especially important in British Columbia because most of our territory is considered unceded territory. So when you combine the BC Supreme Court ruling with this new Musqueam agreement, you've kinda got a pretty big problem on your hands. Because if that court ruling holds, you're now setting legal precedent, meaning that there's a possibility for the land within this agreement to face title claims in the future. Now, here's where things get even weirder. BC Premier David Eby claims he wasn't briefed on this agreement before it happened. Because remember, it's the federal government that signed this agreement, not the provincial government. He made the claim that he had no line of sight to the contents of the agreement, except that he was sitting at the signing ceremony, literally in the front row. That's the best possible line of sight, short of him holding the fucking pen himself. So now he's trying to make the claim that he was there as MLA David Eby, not Premier David Eby, which is kind of like making a big mistake at work, and then when your boss asks you about it, you're like, oh, I wasn't there as the manager, I was just there as a guy that works at the company. Like, come on, man, how fucking stupid do you think your constituents are, David? Now, I can't emphasize this point enough, especially after seeing the comments that people left on the Richmond court case video that I did a while ago. None of this should be framed as Indigenous communities doing anything wrong. These nations are pursuing rights that exist within Canadian law. And after all, the federal government signed this agreement. The real issue here is about government transparency and duty. Our federal government designs agreements like this. They also negotiate the terms within these agreements. So that means that our federal government is responsible for making sure that these agreements benefit Canadians, all Canadians. Now, they can say all they want about, this was just to begin negotiations or whatever, but there are other vehicles that they could have used to do this. They didn't need to sign an agreement. They could have done an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, or honestly, they could have just had a discussion. They didn't need to drop a bombshell like this, especially one with such a lack of clarity. And the issue here is that when policy is unclear, people will fill the gap with whatever thing that they come up with. And most of the time, especially when you're talking about finances, money, households, whatever, big important life things, people are going to fill that gap with fear. And that fear risks turning the public against Indigenous communities and ultimately against reconciliation. So if you feel some kind of way about this, remember that it's our elected officials that put us in this situation. And remember, those elected officials work for us. They owe us transparency. And unfortunately, in cases like this, it feels like they kind of forget about that. And they forget that they work for us. For Canadians. All Canadians. Now, this is a developing story. There will be more news coming. Hopefully, more news means more clarity, but we'll see what happens. I'm Angelo with the Atlas Group. That is enough real estate for today. You're welcome.